all it took was one game back, and apparently teams are back in on potentially trading for Zach LaVine. That's what Joe Cowley from the Chicago Sun-Times will have us believe. We're going to talk about that all and more right after this.
You are now tuned in to Chicago Bulls Central, your number one place for all Chicago Bulls news and content.
What's going on, Bulls fans? Welcome to another episode of Chicago Bulls Central, your number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related. I'm the host, Sir Haize, but more importantly, you guys can follow the channel at Bulls Central Pod on every social media platform we happen to be on. With that being said, let's go ahead and get into the content for today. So after one game back from Zach LaVine, scoring, 16 points, I believe he scored in that game, fitting into what the Chicago Bulls did in a win, it's now apparently teams that are back in potentially on trading for Zach LaVine. Now, this comes from Joe Cowley from the Chicago Sun-Times, and he says this: keep an eye on Sacramento and Golden State as they battle with inconsistency and tough roster decisions, and then there's always the unforeseen injury that could happen to a team with deep playoff aspirations. In other words, a quiet market today could become very loud tomorrow or in the upcoming weeks. Now, keep in mind, there's been a thing around Zach LaVine saying there's been no trade market, no anything for Zach LaVine for weeks. And while I've always said that, hey, as we get closer to that trade deadline, don't be surprised if that no trade market turns into maybe a little trade market, right? Not saying a huge number of teams may be in on Zach LaVine, but there is something to believe that with how Zach LaVine, if he does play well, and considering doing that, there could be teams that are back in on Zach. Now, keep in mind, the Sacramento Kings we talked about before potentially trading for Zach LaVine, and one of the reasons that we talked about that is that apparently pairing with De'Aaron Fox, who is another Clutch Sports agency client, could perform a dangerous backcourt. So, that's something to look out for. Now, it still makes it a little difficult to trade for Zach LaVine. His contract still has $178 million left on it, with that said. And so that goes into the summer of 2027, and that's if Zach LaVine accepts then a $48.9 million player option, which is likely to come and likely to happen. So, hearing that the Kings, may look at pairing Zach LaVine with De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis and Keegan Murray on top of that, which we've already kind of talked about what trade permutations they can come out with to trade for Zach LaVine. I still like a lot of the framework of that deal potentially from the Kings, but it comes down to this: if Zach LaVine is traded, right? I want to make sure that I say if it being a foregone conclusion. I've kind of gone back and forth on, but where there's smoke, there's always sometimes some fire, and I think that as the team move forwards and things like that, I know a lot of Bulls fans have said, well, wait till the offseason. You don't have to do it now. And that's right. You don't have to do it now. But I do think, hearing from Joe Cowley that the Sacramento Kings could get in on that could be interesting. And another team is the Golden State Warriors that was mentioned by Joe Cowley. Now, the fact of the matter is this, right? We've heard some framework around potentially them trading for Zach LaVine before. Shea even brought it up on today's mailbag, potentially a deal surrounding Jonathan Kuminga, who apparently wants to be out of Golden State anyway. They would more than likely have to include Chris Paul and Moses Moody in that type of deal. And I'm not the biggest Jonathan Kuminga guy, right? I look at Jonathan Kuminga and I say, this is a guy who I don't like. Yes, he has potential, right? I don't want to act like he doesn't have potential because he absolutely does. But you're adding young talent, and that may be something that the Bulls are absolutely looking to still do, is add young talent to that team. He fits that timeline, fits that age demographic, things like that we have of a lot of the young players on the team. But, at the end of the day, the Bulls would really have to be enamored. And as I've said before, you take the deal that gets you the best in it. Now, the one thing in a potential trade with the Golden State Warriors that I'm just not in on at all is the Chris Paul aspect of it. Now, that deal that I just mentioned that was rumored, Chris Paul, Jonathan Kuminga, Moses Moody for Zach LaVine. Keep in mind, the Bulls only have one open roster spot. So that means that we would have to send in an additional player. And if it is a Javon Carter, for example, they would have to include more salary. So maybe that's something there that you can look at. But ultimately, hearing that the Kings and the Golden State Warriors could pivot to Zach LaVine, take that for just what it is. It's a could be. It must. Don't take that as it's a for sure a certainty that it will happen, because I really don't think that it is. I don't think in any stretch of the imagination you can say that it's a certainty that either one of those teams will be in on Zach LaVine. Now, as we get closer to the trade deadline, and depending on how teams suffer, how they view the assets that they have on the team, they could become more interested in trading for a player like Zach LaVine. We also got word today on the Lakers saying that the Lakers are a little bit hesitant to acquire Zach LaVine because of the contract that he has. So that's still going to be a barrier for most teams trading for Zach LaVine, but at least for now, we're hearing that teams may be back on. And if Zach LaVine keeps playing well, don't be surprised if those murmurs become a little bit louder as it goes on, and maybe a team does make a move for Zach LaVine at the trade deadline. Maybe he stays pat. Maybe he's a Chicago Bull as well to end the season. We'll see that. We'll talk about it all and more right here. Make sure you guys stay tuned in. Follow the show at Bull Central Pod. You can send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, bullcentralpod@gmail.com. And then lastly, if you want to leave a text message and our voicemail for the mailbag, the number to do so, 773-270-2799. We are the number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related, thanks to you guys. And like I like to end every episode on, go Bulls. Love you guys. See red if you can, y'all. Peace.
This has been a presentation of the Break Media.